He didn't bark at the man leading the child. He barked at the lawyer 3 terminals away, the one no one was watching, the one whose briefcase held the truth that could unravel it all. And that's when everything stopped. Atlanta International Airport was already buzzing that morning. Families rushing, tourists blinking through jet lag, business travelers lost in meetings and coffee. Bruno's bark cut through it like a siren through glass. Not a bark for attention, a warning, a challenge, a line drawn. What happened next uncovered fake identities, forged custody papers, and a boy on the brink of vanishing forever. But this isn't about the airport, or the man or the crime. It's about a dog one dismissed as old, difficult, and past his prime who refused to stay silent. If this moment grabbed your heart, don't just watch, feel it, and tell us, where are you watching from, and what part hit you hardest? Drop a comment, like, and subscribe. Bruno heard what the world ignored. Maybe now, it's our turn. Hartsfield-Jackson Atlanta International Airport, pulsed with its usual morning rhythm, rushed goodbyes. Rolling suitcases, steaming coffee cups balancing in tired hands. The distant hum of jet engines reverberated through Terminal B, weaving into the chorus of airport announcements and footsteps over polished floors. Officer Darius Cole walked with even, steady strides beside his canine partner Bruno, a German shepherd with a coat of black and deep walnut, a build like a tank, and eyes that always scanned first and blinked second. The pair were an unmissable silhouette, Cole, with his crisp dark-blue uniform and composed demeanor, and Bruno, calm but taut like a loaded spring. Darius glanced at his watch. 9:07 a.m. The morning shift had started with routine sniff checks of luggage near Gate B42, followed by a pass-through customs. Bruno had been quiet, alert as always but undisturbed. Not that it meant much, Bruno never barked unless something was off. He had once gone through a 7-hour patrol without a sound. Garrett's brother had been in no non-such sound. Not what made what happened next so jarring. They were passing the main escalator of Terminal B when it happened. Out of nowhere, Bruno froze mid-stride. His head snapped to the left, ears standing like radar dishes. Then the bark came. One single, bone-deep, chest-rattling bark that ricocheted off glass and metal and silenced the terminal like a power outage. Heads turned. A baby cried. A woman dropped her coffee. It wasn't just the volume, it was the intention in the sound. Darius stopped cold. His hand instinctively tightened on Bruno's leash, but the dog didn't move forward or backward. He stood firm, eyes locked on someone down the corridor. "Bruno?" Darius whispered, voice low and tense. "What is it, buddy?" Bruno didn't glance at him, instead his focus narrowed on a tall man in a slate-gray suit, walking calmly alongside a young boy. The boy, no more than 5 or 6, clutched a frayed stuffed rabbit and wore a red hoodie with the hood pulled far over his forehead. The man, white, clean-shaven, glasses perched on his nose, seemed utterly at ease. He had a rolling carry-on and a leather briefcase. Everything about him screamed business traveler. Except Bruno wasn't buying it. Darius adjusted his grip on the leash and approached them. "Excuse me, sir," he said, positioning himself slightly in front of the man's path. "Can I have a moment of your time?" The man stopped. His smile was smooth, measured. "Of course, officer. Is there a problem? Your dog seems—" "Here's your name, sir?" Darius asked. "Sebastian Voss," the man replied without hesitation. "I'm flying to Brussels with my son. Connecting through JFK, everything's in order." He handed over 2 passports before Darius could even request them. The documents seemed legit. French passports. The boy was listed as Lucien Voss. Birth certificate, entry stamp, even a custody document from a court in Texas. Nothing appeared amiss, but Darius had been in the force long enough to know when a dog wasn't reacting to paperwork. The boy, Lucien, wasn't reacting at all. Didn't look at Darius, didn't flinch when Bruno growled, didn't grip Sebastian's hand tight. In fact, he didn't move. He stared straight ahead like a statue, eyes distant, blank, detached from the moment. "He's shy," Sebastian offered calmly. "Trauma history, we're traveling for medical reasons. I'd prefer it if we didn't push him." Darius narrowed his eyes. Something in his gut twisted. He remembered a briefing from 3 years ago in Marseille, Bruno's deployment with NATO task force, sniffing out children hidden in false-named vehicles. children trafficked under the pretense of private adoption. It had been Bruno's first active tour. He'd found 5 missing minors in 1 month. He hadn't been wrong since. And now he wasn't just growling. Bruno had entered lock mode. Firm stance, ears forward, tail stiff. He only did that when he was sure. "I'll need you to come with us for a quick secondary screening," Darius said, forcing his voice to remain neutral. "Of course," Sebastian replied, still composed, adjusting the boy's hoodie. "I understand." They walked silently toward the inspection hallway. Darius couldn't help but notice something odd in the mirrored wall they passed. Sebastian never once looked down at Lucien, not with care, not with concern, not with connection. He walked beside the boy the same way you might walk beside carry-on luggage. Bruno's steps grew tighter, his muscles tensing with each footfall. Darius felt the leash strain just slightly, just enough to know the dog wanted to bark again, but was holding back. Inside the secondary screening room, Sebastian took a seat without complaint. Lucien stood beside him silently. "I'm calling in social services," Darius told his partner over the radio, "and get Interpol on standby." Back outside, Bruno sat at the door, unmoving. His breath was shallow, waiting, watching. Still locked in, something had started, and it wasn't going to be simple. Bruno sat like a statue outside the secondary screening room, his breath controlled but tight, his gaze pinned to the steel door, as if daring it to reveal what he already knew. Inside, Officer Darius Cole paced slowly along the perimeter of the sterile white room, glancing occasionally at the 2 figures seated on opposite ends of the interrogation table. Sebastian Voss was as composed as ever, fingers laced, spine straight, legs crossed at the ankle. The boy sat beside him, still clutching the frayed rabbit, unmoving, unspeaking, his eyes locked on the floor with a kind of blank focus that made Darius's skin crawl. He had seen that expression before, not in criminals but in survivors. It wasn't the look of shyness. It was the residue of silence forced over time, silence turned into armor. Darius pulled a chair across the floor with a scraping echo, deliberately sitting closer to the boy than to the man. The action was subtle, almost unnoticeable, but Sebastian's gaze followed the movement. Just slightly. "Is he always this quiet?" Darius asked casually, keeping his voice level but probing. Sebastian smiled faintly, not looking at the boy. "He's sensitive," he said. "He doesn't respond well to strangers or questions, especially after everything he's been through." The way he spoke, smooth, deliberate, mildly distant, rubbed Darius the wrong way. "Lucien," Darius said gently, using the boy's name on purpose, trying to draw him out. "Lucien, can you look at me for a second, buddy?" No response, not even a flinch. Darius watched the child's shoulders carefully. No twitch, no tension, not even a breath shift, like a doll being posed for display. Then Bruno did something unexpected. From behind the door, the dog suddenly let out a single sharp bark, followed by a scratching noise. Their eyes met, only for half a second. Then Lucien looked down again. But it was enough. Sebastian remained silent, his expression unreadable. Not once had he referred to the boy by name. Not Lucien, not even my son. Always the boy, or my child, or he. Darius had been trained to pick up on verbal distancing, the kind traffickers and manipulators use to keep themselves from forming connection. This wasn't just legal formality, this was intentional. Outside, Bruno scratched again, this time more firmly. Darius stood and opened the door halfway. Bruno didn't move from his seated position but looked up at him with unwavering eyes. "You want in?" Darius whispered. Bruno didn't bark. He didn't wag. He simply stood up and walked through the door, like he belonged there. Sebastian shifted slightly, the first sign of discomfort. Bruno walked past Darius without hesitation and sat directly beside Lucien. Slowly, deliberately, he reached out one paw and tapped the boy's shin. Lucien blinked. Another tap. Gentle, not forceful. Then Bruno leaned forward and nudged the stuffed rabbit with his snout, pushing it slightly toward Lucien's lap. It was like flipping a switch. Lucien's fingers tightened around the toy, then barely visibly his lips moved. No sound came, but Darius caught the shape of a word. "Merci." He hadn't spoken to Sebastian, he hadn't reacted to anyone else, but to Bruno he whispered gratitude. Sebastian cleared his throat lightly, trying to regain control of the room. "Officer, I'm not sure this is—" "What did he say?" Darius cut in, his tone sharper now, laced with edge. "Did you hear that?" "He didn't say anything, he's just tired." "You?" Darius replied. "He said something, I saw it, and I think you did too." Sebastian didn't respond. Lucien glanced up again just for a moment, and Bruno, now lying at his feet, gave a low, steady huff. Not a growl, just presence, like he was grounding the boy. Darius leaned forward on the table, his forearms folded tight. "How long have you had custody of him?" he asked. 3 months, Sebastian said smoothly. "You've been processing his medical care here in the States." "I have the court papers, I read them," Darius said. "You keep saying we, Mr. Voss." "Who's we?" Sebastian paused, just for a heartbeat. "My firm. Our organization facilitates international adoptions. Everything is vetted." "Interesting," Darius muttered, "because I ran those documents through DHS 20 minutes ago, and your firm doesn't come up on any of the federal registries for legal adoption services." Silence. Lucien pulled his feet up into the chair, curling slightly. Bruno pressed closer. Darius stood again. "You mind if I speak with the boy alone?" "I do," Sebastian said sharply, his voice suddenly losing its composure. "He's a minor under my legal guardianship. You have no right. He's also a foreign national, currently inside a U.S. federal transit zone." Darius cut him off coldly. "Which means, until his guardianship is fully verified, you don't get to say no." Bruno let out another low breath, this one almost a growl. Sebastian rose to his feet abruptly, hands open but stiff. "This is absurd. I've cooperated fully, and you're gonna keep cooperating," Darius replied, stepping between him and the boy. "Because if you so much as twitch the wrong way, I've got a federal warrant on standby and 3 DHS officers waiting by gate C." He signaled to the hallway. 2 uniformed officers stepped in quietly. "Escort Mr. Voss to room 4. Hold him there until further notice." Sebastian didn't protest. He straightened his cuffs, nodded once, and walked out without looking back. Lucien didn't move. As the door closed behind them, Darius knelt in front of the child. "You're safe, Lucien," he said softly. "You don't have to talk if you're not ready, just—" Bruno nuzzled the boy's hand. Lucien didn't cry, didn't speak, but for the first time, he shifted closer to the dog. And Darius knew, whatever this was, it had just begun. The door clicked shut behind Sebastian, sealing the room in a heavy kind of silence, one not born from stillness, but from the vacuum that follows tension. Darius stayed crouched near Lucien, careful not to crowd the boy, letting the quiet sit long enough for the child to notice it wasn't a trap. Bruno lay beside Lucien's chair, close but not touching, eyes half closed in that calm way K9s did when trying not to overwhelm. He wasn't there to work now, he was just there. Darius glanced toward the side table in the room, where a small basket of donated supplies sat, likely for detained families or bored kids waiting with parents under investigation. Among the items were a coloring book, a few worn-down crayons, and 1 sharpened pencil. Without a word, Darius stood, walked over, picked up the pencil and a plain sheet of white paper, and gently slid them across the table in front of Lucien. He didn't give instructions. He didn't say, "Draw something." He just gave the boy a choice. Lucien looked at the paper, then at the pencil, then at Bruno. Darius backed off just enough to lean against the wall and wait. The clock ticked. Somewhere far down the hall a door closed. Shoes squeaked. A radio crackled. But inside this room, everything slowed to the pace of Lucien's hand as he reached out and took the pencil between his small fingers. He didn't draw right away. First, he held the pencil up to his face, staring at the eraser, sniffing it like it was a foreign object. Then, like a tremor across glass, the lines began quick, light strokes. Short lines, one long vertical, then another, a curved shape beside it. Darius said nothing, just watched, his gut tightening with every mark. When Lucien was done, he held up the paper without speaking. Darius crossed the room slowly and looked down at what the boy had drawn. It was a child, a small figure with a circle face, eyes like hollow dots, arms hanging down limp. Next to the child was a taller figure, male, broad-shouldered, wearing what looked like a suit. The figure had eyes, a nose but no mouth, The face was completely smooth where the mouth should have been. Not a race, just never drawn. Darius felt his jaw lock. Lucien lowered the page slowly, staring at him, not looking for approval, just waiting to see what Darius would do with what he now knew. Darius swallowed. "Is that man, Sebastian?" he asked carefully, keeping his voice soft. Lucien blinked but didn't nod. He didn't need to. Bruno stirred slightly, shifting so that his paw brushed the edge of Lucien's shoe. The boy looked down, then slowly got off the chair, paper still in hand, and moved toward the corner of the room where the wall met a padded bench. He sat cross-legged on the floor. Bruno followed him without hesitation, curling up beside the child like a shadow melting into the corner. For several minutes, Darius let them be. He typed notes into his tablet, cross-checked international reports for missing children under the name Lucien in France. Nothing surfaced. The digital records were clean but too clean. No child with that name and birthday had ever enrolled in school, received a medical exam, or been listed in municipal census data. It was as if Lucien had only started existing 3 months ago. Then, a whisper, so faint that Darius thought it was just the air vent. But when he looked up, Lucien was leaning forward slightly, his lips close to Bruno's ear. His voice trembled not from fear but from effort, like it hurt to let sound out. "I remember the smell," he murmured, eyes half-lidded, voice hoarse, "of white roses on her hair." Darius's hands stopped mid-ed. Bruno stayed still, completely still except for his breathing deep and slow like a lullaby. Lucien placed his forehead against the dog's neck, gripping the fur like a rope he might be pulled from the dark. He said, "If I get lost," the boy continued, barely audible, "follow the dog. The dog will know." Darius rose slowly, not to interrupt, but to let the moment exist. He took a step closer and crouched, keeping his voice low. "Lucien," he said gently, "who told you that? Who said to follow the dog?" "Maman," Lucien whispered. "Juliette." That name hit like a jolt, not just because it was the first proper noun the boy had uttered, but because it came with warmth, a trace of something emotional, something real. Lucien rubbed his cheek against Bruno's fur. "She wore white roses when she put me on the train." A clue, a smell. Bruno let out a soft whine, not distress, not warning, just presence. Lucien murmured again, even softer. "I waited for her to come back, but he came instead." Darius felt his stomach sink. He could only mean one person. He stood slowly and pulled out his phone, quickly sending a message to Renee Caldwell, Child Services Specialist attached to federal investigations. "Need immediate psych eval and trauma protocol. Minor named Lucien. Possible abduction." Then he added, keywords, "White Roses, Juliet Trainham, France." As he slid the phone back into his pocket, Bruno turned his head slightly toward Darius, like he understood what had just happened. Lucien didn't open his eyes, but his grip on Bruno didn't loosen. The forensic request came back faster than expected, and when it did, Darius barely blinked at the red stamp in the subject line. Preliminary match. The swab they'd collected from the edge of Sebastian's right loafer had tested positive for dried human blood. Quantity minimal but present, hidden so discreetly that only a trained dog's nose could have detected it. And it wasn't just blood. The analysis specified the sample contained markers consistent with a child aged under 7 years old. Darius exhaled slowly, letting the information settle. In the concrete stillness of his small office inside the secure screening wing, the fluorescent lighting flickered ever so faintly, humming above him like an old fridge. He looked down at Bruno, who lay stretched across the floor near the desk, head up, eyes fixed like sentinels at the door. Not asleep, never fully asleep when something was still moving. "Good nose," Darius muttered quietly. Bruno thumped his tail once, just once. This wasn't proof of a crime yet, at least not in the legal sense, but it was enough to elevate suspicion to something closer to cause. Combined with Lucien's whispered words, the drawing, the refusal to use Sebastian's name, and now a literal trace of blood. The case had turned. Darius opened the shared DHS Interpol case database and typed Juliette Moreau into the missing persons index. 2 results appeared. One for a 36-year-old Frenchwoman last registered as a hospital nurse in Marseille, and another for a tourist visa application never approved filed 4 months ago through the American consulate in Bordeaux. He clicked both. His eyes narrowed as he traced the timeline. Juliette had filed a missing child report with the French National Police. Her son, Lucien, vanished from the station platform at Marseille-Saint Charles after being handed over temporarily to a man claiming to be a social worker from Texas. The man had documents. He had credentials, he had paperwork bearing seals from a U.S. consular office based in Austin. That's what made it official. That's what made it legal. Darius sat back in his chair and rubbed the side of his face with both hands, dragging his palms down his jaw. Then he clicked into the Austin consulate contact list and searched for the stamp number listed on the document Sebastian had shown him during their first interaction. It matched. Stamped from the Office of Consular Certifications, Special Visa and Custody Affairs. But that office hadn't existed for over a year. It had been shut down after a federal audit uncovered administrative inconsistencies. A soft phrase meaning fraud and document laundering. Darius stood up so quickly his chair squealed behind him. He grabbed his phone and dialed directly to Renee Caldwell, who just arrived on site to speak with Lucienne. She picked up on the second ring. "I need you to listen very carefully," he said without greeting. "The passport's real, but the signature and the consular authority that stamped it, they're tied to a fake division. Ghost office shut down last year. Do not let that kid out of your sight." Renee's voice dropped. "Understood, I've got him, he's with Bruno, drawing again." "Good," Darius replied. "Don't let anyone near him, not even uniformed staff, unless they have dual clearance." He hung up and started pacing. This wasn't just a domestic custody dispute anymore. This was cross-border fraud, possibly organized child relocation under false legal cover, facilitated by someone or several someones with access to high-level clearance. The next call Darius made was to Homeland Security's Internal Affairs Division. He didn't have a case number yet, just a hunch and a bleeding trail made of scent and silence. But they were listening now. He summarized the facts in clipped professional bursts. Minor detained under suspicion of abduction, inconsistent adoption paperwork, biological mother listed as having filed an unacknowledged missing persons report, blood trace found on suspect's shoe, document stamps linked to defunct consulate office under investigation for falsifying child transfer certification. The officer on the line, an agent named Reyes, said only 4 words before she hung up. "Send everything right now." Darius compiled the file in under 5 minutes. The last thing he added before pressing send was the child's drawing. He attached it with no comment, letting the image speak louder than legal jargon. A child with no voice, a man with no mouth. A system that had seen nothing. He stared at the screen after sending it, heart thudding with a rhythm Bruno seemed to match, his breathing slow and steady nearby. Darius turned back to the surveillance feed. He rewound the hallway camera from earlier that morning. The footage of Sebastian and Lucien walking through Terminal B played silently, over and over. On the third loop, he saw something new, a flash of movement in the reflection of the glass. Sebastian, checking his watch, didn't look at Lucien once, not even when the boy stumbled on a loose tile. Lucien had caught himself alone. Darius fast-forward to the moment Bruno barked. Pause right there. Bruno had stepped between Sebastian and the boy, not at Darius's command, not out of confusion. He was protecting, not reacting, anticipating. Darius made one last call before heading back down to the interview room. This time he rang Captain Edithia Monroe, his supervisor and head of the K-9 task force. When she picked up, he said, "I need to flag this case as red level, international threat potential. An ED-run background on Sebastian Voss, full financials, travel, associates, anyone he's been linked to in the last 2 years." There was a pause, then a tired voice replied, "You've got it. We're moving this upstairs." Darius pocketed the phone and headed down the hallway. The corridor leading to room 2 was dim. The air outside the door, Renee stood with arms crossed, expression pale but composed. "He's drawing again," she whispered. "Bruno hasn't moved from his side." Darius nodded once. Then he pushed open the door without a word. The moment Darius stepped back into the interview room, the air shifted not in temperature, not in scent, but in weight. It had grown denser somehow, quieter in the way grief is quiet. pressing but invisible to the untrained eye. Lucien sat on the floor where he had been, his small frame curled beside Bruno's, one hand tangled in the dog's thick black-brown fur, and a crumpled piece of paper in the other. The boy wasn't drawing now, he was staring, wide-eyed and unblinking, at the corner of the room as though trying to remember something that wasn't his to remember. Bernardo's noisy and ever-shifting screams simply remained there, a solid presence beside a fragile silence, watching Lucien like a bodyguard listens for heartbeats beneath rubble. Darius closed the door behind him and took a slow step forward, then another, until he was crouched just a few feet from the pair. "Hey," he said softly, not expecting a response but offering one anyway. "You doing okay?" Lucien didn't answer, but he looked up, and in that glance, brief as it was, Darius saw something that hadn't surfaced before, a glimmer not of fear or trust, but of familiarity. Like something in Darius's face was ringing faint bells in the child's mind. Darius tilted his head slightly and gave the boy a small, careful smile. "Can I see what you drew?" Lucien hesitated, then slowly unfolded the paper and handed it over. Darius took it gently, unfolding the corners like one might a message from the past, and saw a new drawing, this time a garden, trees, a swing set, a tall woman with flowers in her hair, her face colored with soft pinks and reds, and beside her, a child with a wide smile. Behind them stood a house with yellow shutters and a blue door. Darius blinked. It was a place that didn't exist on any map, but he knew it was real. It had to be. "Is that your home?" he asked. Lucien nodded once, barely. Gestru's nails up, late enough dolly to be blindingly blurred the table. He turned toward Lucien again, and that's when he saw. He'd seen that scar before, exactly that one. His hands went cold, his vision blurred at the edges. His breath caught in his throat like a stone too big to swallow. A memory surged uninvited, refillous of another child years ago, who'd once crawled into his lap, giggling with chocolate around his mouth, asking for just one more cartoon before bedtime. Lilia, his son. Darius closed his eyes briefly, pain flaring his chest like an old wound being touched by a new rain. That scar behind Elijah's ear had been from a fall on the porch when he was 4, tripped running toward the ice cream truck. They'd laughed about it later, called it his pirate ear. It was stupid, silly, one of those harmless things you never expect to matter again, until it does, until it stares back at you from the side of another boy's head, 5 years after you buried your own. He shouldn't have felt it, this crushing ache, this warping of present and past, but he did, and it came fast. Elijah had been taken not in the way of traditional loss, but by a paperwork error, a loophole that allowed a private agency to issue a fraudulent adoption request, while by the time the legal mess was uncovered, Elijah had already been placed with a family in another state. 2 weeks later, the boy drowned in an unsupervised backyard pool. He'd only been 5. Darius hadn't even known he was missing until it was too late. And after that, everything had broken. His marriage, his faith, himself. The department had put him on administrative leave. Therapists came and went, but the only constant had been Bruno. The only thing that didn't flinch when Darius raged, didn't retreat when he cried, didn't ask him to explain the unexplainable. The dog had been a leash between Darius and the rest of the world, keeping him just tethered enough not to vanish. And now, here he was again, staring at a different child with the same scar. Not his son, but close enough to split him wide open. He tried to blink the burn away from his eyes, but Lucien had already seen it. The boy looked at him with something new, curiosity, and maybe the earliest flicker of connection. Darius cleared his throat. "You remind me of someone," he said softly. Lucien didn't answer, but he leaned against Bruno a little more, and Bruno shifted in kind, his eyes flicking toward Darius like he too understood. The silence stretched. Darius didn't try to fill it. He just sat there with them, in that impossible triangle of loss and recognition, trying to figure out how the past had found its way into the present again. Then, outside the door, a knock broke through the quiet. 3 sharp raps. Darius stood slowly, brushed the front of his uniform and crossed to open it. A young officer handed him a sealed file with the Homeland Security watermark across the front. "Urgent update from Interpol, sir," the officer said. "About the Voss guy." Darius nodded and took the file. He opened it carefully, hands steady despite the storm still rolling under his ribs. Inside was a photo, grainy but clear enough, Sebastian Voss standing on a marina dock in Barcelona last year, shaking hands with a man flagged in DHS watch lists for human trafficking. Beneath the photo was a list of flagged transactions, offshore transfers, coded under shell charities, all originating from a now-defunct adoption intermediary based in Marseille. Darius flipped the page and froze again. There was a name, Juliette Moreau, Lucien's mother. The last known contact she made was to that same agency. Her application for custody recertification had been delayed due to clerical backlog, but it had never been processed. She hadn't been heard from since. Darius looked back at Lucien, who now lay curled beneath Bruno's front legs, eyes closed, fingers still tangled in fur. That scar behind his ear pulsed in Darius's vision like a heartbeat. The past was clawing its way forward, and the only way out now was through. Darius stood in the dim glow of the security monitoring suite, his arms crossed tightly as rows of footage played across the wall of screens in front of him. The video file had been flagged by a junior analyst during a deep review of all movement patterns tied to Sebastian Voss within the airport. And what it revealed wasn't just irregular. It was a fault line splitting straight through the foundation of trust within their own walls. On screen, timestamped just 24 minutes before Bruno's bark had shaken Terminal B, Sebastian appeared on the upper-level mezzanine between gates 36 and 37. Dressed the same as earlier, gray suit, briefcase, eyes hidden behind polarized lenses. At first he stood alone, back straight, posture casual. But then, from the edge of the frame, a figure approached. A man in TSA uniform, badge clipped cleanly to his belt, carrying a clipboard under one arm. They didn't shake hands, no documents exchanged, no verbal cues that could be lip-read clearly. But their body language was unmistakable, short, direct eye contact. A glance around to check blind spots, then a quick exchange no longer than 9 seconds. And then they parted ways like strangers. The feed ended 2 minutes later with Sebastian disappearing toward the customs corridor. But Darius had the system pull metadata tags on the staffer, name Alan Trask, position Tier 3 floor operations, clearance level medium. Darius requested Trask be located for questioning, but the response came back with a void he didn't expect. Trask had clocked out early that day, citing medical family emergency. His apartment, a one-edmer on the east side, had been vacated less than an hour after his shift ended. No forwarding address, no pings on personal devices, no digital trail. Gone. Erased. Just like that, Darius leaned forward, hands on the table, bracing his weight against the nausea curling in his stomach. He had seen sabotage before, on missions overseas, in tactical ops, in procedural screw-ups made by men who didn't know what silence could cost. But this was something more coordinated, more careful, like a wire being plucked by someone who knew exactly which vibrations would go unheard. He took the external hard drive containing the footage and locked it in the vault. Then he walked back to his workstation and logged into his personal interdepartmental terminal, scanning through comms history, internal briefings, and flagged access requests. As he was reviewing one of the surveillance sync updates, his screen flickered. For a moment, he thought it was lag and overload on the server, but then it blinked again, not in a system error pattern, but in an overwrite flash. A new window opened. It wasn't from any system he recognized. It was plain, white, just one line of black type. No header, no security signature, just words. If you keep digging coal, I can't guarantee you make it to the weekend. Darius froze. Not out of fear, he'd been threatened before. But never like this. Never from inside his own firewall. He reached for the keyboard, tried to backtrace the message path, but the window closed itself instantly. Auto-wipe. Whatever program had been used to burn on contact. He sat there for a second, heart pounding, not because of the message's content, but because of what it implied. This wasn't random. This wasn't desperation. It was embedded. Someone, maybe multiple people inside his own network, had enough access to slip a message like that through firewalled interlinks without leaving a trace. And they were watching. Bruno stirred beneath the desk, ears twitching, eyes sharpening as if reading Darius's rising tension. Darius didn't speak. He simply reached down, his palm brushing the side of the dog's neck, grounding himself on the only soul in the building he trusted without hesitation. After a moment, he stood and walked back to the hallway, heading straight for Captain Monroe's office. She was the only one who'd backed him this far without question, but even that wasn't enough anymore. He needed confirmation. She looked up as he entered, eyebrows arched. "You look like hell." "Thanks," Darius said dryly. "Do me a favor. Run a scan on system breach reports from the past 6 months. Any unsanctioned message routing, even ones that didn't get flagged, and look into access logs for every person assigned to Voss's intake this morning." Monroe's brow furrowed. "What's going on?" "I got a ghost message on my DHS node," he said. "You trace? No source. Threatening." Came from inside the firewall. Her eyes sharpened. "Shit. Yeah. You think someone in this department is playing for the other side?" "I think more than one." Monroe stood slowly, her face turning hard. "I'll get someone from cyber forensics. Low profile. This smells like a chain." Monroe nodded once. "You got it." Darius turned to go, but her voice followed him. "Be careful, Day." "Always," he replied, even though it hadn't been true for years. Back in the interview room, Bruno had returned to his place beside Lucien, who now held a folded drawing against his chest like a secret. Renee was speaking softly to him from across the table, asking him about colors, smells, his favorite songs. But Lucien barely responded. His eyes were distant, focused on something only he could see. Darius stepped in, his presence shifting the air. Renee looked up, question already forming on her lips, but he shook his head. "Not now. Not here." He knelt beside the boy. "Lucy," he said gently, "can I ask you something?" Lucy looked up slowly, eyes dull but watching. "Do you remember the man who said he was your father?" Lucy nodded. "Did he ever tell you not to talk to people?" The boy stared. Then, softly, he whispered, "He said they wouldn't believe me." Darius felt something sharp lodge in his chest. He glanced at Bruno, who hadn't looked away. Then he looked back at Lucien. "Well," he said, steady now, voice like steel wrapped in velvet, "I believe you, okay?" Lucien didn't answer, but this time he didn't look away. And Bruno, at 5:41 p.m., a courier in a dark blue blazer entered the federal wing of Hartsfield-Jackson with a sealed folder and a badge number that passed every level of clearance. The envelope bore the official letterhead of the Texas Department of Child and Family Services, signed by a state-appointed judge and notarized with federal acknowledgement. The language was clean, curt, and devastating based on verified documents and consular recognition. The state acknowledged Sebastian Voss as the legal guardian of Lucien Moreau, with no active red flags or pending criminal charges, and thus ordered his immediate release from detainment and the return of his dependent, Lucien, into his custody by no later than 10:00 p.m. local time. Darius held the paper like a death certificate. It felt heavier than it should, like the ink itself was dipped in poison. He read it twice, then a third time, scanning for errors, flaws, something he could use to stall it. But the signatures were real, the seals were valid, and the judge's credentials were bulletproof. A legal freight train had been set in motion by ghosts operating behind desks thousands of miles away, and there was nothing in the body of the order that acknowledged Lucien's drawing, his whispers, the blood on Sebastian's shoe, or the threat Darius had received hours earlier. Facts had been scrubbed from the story. The weight of bureaucracy was now pressing down like a concrete slab, and time was running out. Darius stormed into Monroe's office without knocking, the order already shaking in his hand. She took one look at his face and swore under her breath before snatching the page from him. Her eyes raced across the document, then closed with a sharp inhale. "Jesus," she muttered. "They're fast. They're prepared," Darius corrected. His voice tight, the room was immediately still. Meltdown command, partnerships at work. The man-based wizardry band from the hips shift. "You know that." "Doesn't matter, it's legal. There has to be a countermand, not without evidence admissible in court. Within the hour." Interpol flagged him. Interpol hasn't issued the red notice yet. It's still in procedural review. "We don't have enough, so what do we do?" Monroe asked, her hands fisting. Darius didn't answer. He didn't need to, because outside the room, echoing faintly down the corridor, a sound broke through the rising dread like a siren cutting fog. It was a cry, raw, high-pitched, heart-wrenching. Darius was out the door before Monroe could stop him. He sprinted down the corridor toward interview room 2, Bruno's leash still hanging from his hand. What he saw when he pushed the door open stopped him in his tracks. Two uniformed officers had just escorted Bruno out of the room. They hadn't manhandled him, protocol wouldn't allow it, but they were leading him toward the canine rest area for reassignment. Inside the room, Lucien had crumpled to the floor, his little chest convulsing with ragged sobs, arms wrapped around a ragged, one-eyed stuffed rabbit as if it were an oxygen mask. Renee knelt nearby, but the boy didn't register her. His face was blotched, streaked with tears and snot, his mouth open in a scream that shook the walls. I don't want to go with him," he wailed. "Don't make me go. Don't make me go with him." Darius moved forward like lightning. "Bring him back," he barked at the officers now. "Sir, we were told bring him back." The officers hesitated only a second before turning, one jogging to retrieve Bruno, the other freezing in place under Darius's stare. Renee looked up at him, her face stricken. Lucien sobbed louder. "I want to stay with the dog. He's the only one who doesn't lie." His voice cracked on the word lie, and he buried his face in the rabbit's ear. Darius dropped to one knee beside him, heart thudding so loud he could barely think. "Lucien," he said, voice low, careful. "Look at the mean." The boy shook his head. "Lucien," Darius repeated firmer now. "You're not going anywhere yet." They're both uniquely fixated on this stranger man. They're wrong, he'll take me back, not if I can help it. "But the papers aren't truth, you are." Just then Bruno returned, pulled gently by the officer who had sprinted back. The moment the dog re-entered the room, Lucien surged forward and threw himself into his fur, wrapping his arms around the animal like it was the last solid thing in the universe. Bruno didn't bark. He just curled slightly around the child, protective, steady, warm. Darius stood, turned to the officer and said, "No one separates them again. No one." "Sir, I have orders. Overraid them, or send your supervisor, I'll handle the fallout." Renee rose slowly. The trauma spike in that boy's voice. "I've only heard that in severe PTSD cases. That's not performance. That's memory." "Exactly," Darius said. "And if they take him tonight, we might never get another chance to protect him." "So what do we do?" she whispered. Darius turned to the mirrored glass of the observation panel, staring at his own reflection in the dark. "We stall, we expose, and if that fails, we fight like hell." From the hallway came the distant sound of a gate announcement over the intercom. The hands of the wall clock ticked toward 6:00 p.m. 4 hours left until the order activated, and the countdown had just begun. At 6:11 p.m., Renee Caldwell burst into Darius's office, with her laptop clutched like a detonator about to go off, her face flushed and her breath uneven, not from exertion but from the rush of knowing she had finally found a crack in the concrete wall that had been closing around them since morning. Darius looked up from the case file he had been highlighting in red lines and lines of inadmissible truths, all wrapped in bureaucratic lace, and saw in her expression that something had shifted. Something real, something urgent. "Tell me you found something," he said without standing. Renee nodded fast, stepping forward and flipping her laptop around so he could see the search thread she had traced through a public appeal database used by foreign nationals seeking child custody support abroad. Her finger hovered over a name. "Juliette Moreau," she said. "Filed a missing child report in Marseille 74 days ago. Disappeared from the system 2 weeks later." "You already knew that," Darius replied, not impatiently but guarded. "I know," she said, voice steadying. "But I found the original police statement. She said her son was taken by a man claiming to be a social worker connected to an American adoption facilitator operating in Marseille under the name Avenir Enfant Libre, Future Free Children." Darius's eyebrows lifted. "That group got flagged in an Interpol sweep 2 years ago." "Exactly," Renee said, "except they resurfaced under a new name, Safe Path International, based in Austin, Texas." "Which ties back to the forged consulate stamp," Darius muttered, his brain racing to connect the dots. "Juliette knew," Renee continued. "She knew from the moment Lucien disappeared, but nobody took her seriously because she was undocumented. Her visa had expired 2 months earlier. No money, no lawyer, no traction. She vanished," Darius said grimly. "Not vanished," Renee corrected. She got a job under the table as a night nurse at a small clinic outside Arles. And every week since then, like clockwork, she sent out emails, same format, same title, same address, to NGOs, embassies, French family courts, even US consulates. She titled every one the same way. Mon fils enlevé, il est vivant. My son is stolen, he is alive. Darius swallowed hard, leaning closer to the screen. You trace any of them? Most were ignored. A few bounced back, but one got opened 3 days ago by a legal intern in the Paris office of Humanite Sans Frontières, and she responded. Renee clicked again, pulling up the email chain. Darius read the last message out loud. Juliette Moreau, I still have hope. I will keep sending this until someone answers. I do not have papers, but I have love. I just need a voice. For a second, the room went quiet. Even Bruno's breathing seemed to pause, as if the dog too could feel the gravity of a mother who refused to be silent, even when silenced. She clicked again, and there it was, Juliette in a white nurse uniform, standing outside a makeshift building with faded shutters. Hair pulled back in a tight bun, no makeup, eyes tired but locked on the camera like she was daring the world to tell her no again. She's alive, Darius whispered. She's real. She never stopped. Renee nodded, her voice catching. Darius snapped into motion, grabbing his phone, dialing Monroe without hesitation. I've got her, he said the moment she picked up. Juliette Moreau is alive and she's reachable. She's the legal mother, the real one, and we can get to her. Where is she? Arles, France. Working nights at a clinic called Saint-Étienne Santé, under an alias. Can she get here? Not legally, not fast, but we can apply for emergency humanitarian transport under witness protection protocols if we move now. You'll take a judge's authorization. Then get me a judge, Darius said. We don't need to win. We just need to slow this down until sunrise. You'll call DOJ. Don't lose momentum. As soon as the call ended, Darius turned back to Renee. Draft a statement of need. Include Lucien's psychological reaction when Bruno was removed. Every word of what he said, detail her emails, her photo, attach everything, send it to DHS, DOJ, and Interpol. Renee nodded and sat down instantly, her fingers already flying across the keys. Darius looked at Bruno, who now sat upright, alert, head tilted slightly as though listening for a voice across the ocean. We've got you now, kid, Darius murmured to himself. We've got your mother. 30 minutes passed in a blur of email threads, document scanning, jurisdictional transfers and plea calls placed to judges who were halfway through dinner with their families. Monroe returned with a contact inside the French judiciary, willing to expedite a verification request on Juliette's behalf. And within another hour, a diplomatic relay confirmed her identity via a scanned hospital ID, validated by local health ministry officials. It wasn't full asylum, it wasn't even safety, but it was something, a beginning. Darius stood outside the holding room with Renee at his side. Inside, Lucien was asleep on the padded bench, Bruno curled protectively around him like a living barricade. Renee's voice was soft. Do we tell him? Not yet, Darius said. Not until the plane's in the air. She nodded. If this works, she could land before sunrise. If it doesn't, Renee didn't finish the sentence. Neither did he. The clock on the wall read 8:37 p.m. 93 minutes to stop the handoff. The longest hour of their lives was just beginning. At 9:17 p.m., under a rush order from the Department of Justice, and signed off by Judge Ellen Crossfield herself, the courthouse annex inside the Atlanta Federal Complex lit up like a war room during a foreign threat alert. The security doors remained closed to the public. Media had been banned entirely, and every person inside the chamber, lawyers, clerks, bailiffs, federal observers, had undergone expedited background clearance within the last 30 minutes. The room buzzed with tension, legal briefs fluttering like flags in a storm, yet all noise stilled the moment Lucien Moreau entered, holding Bruno's leash in one trembling hand and the corner of his stuffed rabbit in the other. He walked beside Darius and Renee in small, steady steps, his red hoodie hanging low, casting a soft shadow over his face. Judge Crossfield, a stern woman with steel-rimmed glasses and a reputation for dismantling corruption with surgical precision, motioned for quiet. Let the child approach the bench, she said. Darius gave Lucien a light nod. The boy stepped forward. Every eye tracked him, but none more sharply than Sebastian Voss, seated confidently at the defense table, flanked by two sharply dressed attorneys who exuded expensive apathy. His hands were clasped in front of him, his expression unreadable. Bruno followed Lucien, not pulling, not leading, just walking close, like a tether made of muscle and memory. The room remained breathless. "State your name for the record," Judge Crossfield said, voice gentler than expected. Lucien glanced at Darius, then whispered, "Lucien." "Louder, sweetheart," the judge encouraged. "Lucien Moreau," he said again, clearer now. "Do you know the man sitting at that table?" she asked, pointing. Lucien's eyes lifted. He scanned the table. Then slowly he raised one finger and pointed not at the lawyers but directly at Sebastian. "Yes," he said, "that's the man who took me." A hush fell so fast it collapsed like a dropped sheet. "Did he ever tell you anything about your mother?" the judge asked carefully. Lucien nodded. He said, "She died. And what did your mother tell you before you were taken?" Lucien took a shaky breath. His hands clutched the rabbit tighter. Then he said, "She told me, if I got lost, to find someone who smelled like white roses." The phrase hung in the air like a spell, piercing through the concrete walls of due process and forcing even the defense attorneys to glance sideways at each other. Darius felt Renee suck in a breath beside him. Bruno gave a low whine, almost a hum. The judge leaned forward. "Do you know what that means, Lucien?" "Yes," he whispered. "It means she was still alive." "And who smells like white roses?" Lucien hesitated. Then he turned, walked 3 steps toward the prosecution's side of the room, and pointed to Renee. "Her shampoo smells like it. That's why I trusted her." It wasn't a confession. It was a roadmap back to the truth. The judge exhaled slowly, then shifted her gaze to the defense table. "Mr. Voss," she said, "do you have any statement to counter this testimony?" Sebastian smiled faintly. "Your Honor, the child is traumatized. He's been manipulated. Then you won't mind if we review all available digital records tied to your custody claims," she replied. "We've already begun forensic examination of your document trail." Sebastian didn't flinch, but someone else did. From the second row of the defense bench, a young attorney mid-30s, dark blazer, hollowed eyes, shifted just slightly, reaching for his laptop bag too smoothly. Two-timed. Bruno's ears perked. Darius noticed instantly. The dog's whole body tightened like a spring, and in a flash 2 sharp barks rang through the courtroom. Every head turned. Bruno didn't bark again. He launched, not at Sebastian, but at the attorney in the second row. The man screamed, stumbled backward, dropping his laptop as Bruno knocked him to the ground. In the chaos, the bag hit the floor, unzipped, and out slid a slim silver USB drive. It spun across the tile before coming to rest at Judge Crossfield's feet. The bailiff rushed forward. Bruno already backed off and sitting again, tail mouth shut. "What the hell is that?" the judge demanded. The prosecutor, already moving, snapped on gloves and collected the USB, plugging it into the secure courtroom workshop. The screen blinked to life. Folders popped up. Dates, names, child profiles, financial ledgers, 4 separate children, 4 fake custody routes, 1 identical consulate seal. The courtroom went still again, only now it was no longer just quiet. It was stunned, wrecked, lit from within by a fire that couldn't be put out. Sebastian's jaw clenched. The defense team huddled, voices tense. Judge Crossfield's voice cut through them all. "Mr. Voss, this material, if verified, could constitute evidence of transnational child trafficking, obstruction of justice, and conspiracy to commit federal fraud." No response. She slammed the gavel. "This court is now in recess pending emergency hearing transfer. Custody of Lucien Moreau is hereby revoked from the defendant and granted to protective services under federal jurisdiction." Sebastian stood abruptly, his expression cracking at last, not in rage but in something colder, recognition of the loss of control. 2 officers stepped toward him, cuffs already in hand. Lucien didn't watch. He was crouched beside Bruno again, whispering something that only the dog could hear. The boy didn't cry. He didn't flinch. The courtroom had emptied under the weight of its own revelations. Sebastian Voss now in custody, and every document on that USB drive backed, copied, and handed to federal investigators for deeper excavation. But for Darius, Renee, and Bruno, the mission wasn't complete until one final face stepped through the secured doors of the Child Protection Center. Just after sunrise, her hands trembling as she held her humanitarian travel documents close to her chest. her hair damp with the condensation of a flight spent wide awake. Not from nerves, but from hope held on too tight. And as Juliette Moreau crossed into the reception hall, dressed in a borrowed coat and shoes a size too small, she didn't ask questions, didn't wait to be led. Her eyes locked instantly on the boy curled in the corner with a dog wrapped around him like armor. And in that fraction of a second, she didn't see a courtroom or a nation or a fight. She saw her son, her Lucien, alive and whole and impossibly here. And Lucien, without needing words, without checking faces or verifying voices, lifted his head and let out a whisper that shattered every wall built around his silence. And then he ran full sprint across the tiled floor, dropping the rabbit, dropping the past, and when he reached her, he flung his arms around her waist so hard that she staggered back a step, his face buried in the fabric of her coat, inhaling deeply, desperately, then pulling back just enough to say it again, this time clearer, louder, smiling through the tears that ran down his cheeks like new rivers carved into old stone. "Mom really does smell like roses." And Juliette, shaking, lowered to her knees and held his face in her hands like she was trying to memorize every inch of him before the world could take him again, whispering his name over and over until it became a prayer. And in the periphery of that moment, Bruno approached silently, then stopped, sat, and watched as if bearing witness to something sacred, something beyond comprehension. And when Juliette finally looked up, eyes red, breath shivering, she reached out and stroked Bruno's head, not like a stranger meeting a dog, but like a mother greeting a guardian who had never left her child's side. Her touch full of gratitude too deep for words, and Bruno leaned into her hand, closing his eyes, tail thudding once. That afternoon, after the legal reconfirmation of custody was signed and filed, Darius drove them to a quiet neighborhood just north of the city, where a temporary foster home had been made ready, modest but warm, with tall windows and the scent of freshly laundered linens. And Lucien, now dressed in clean clothes and carrying his battered rabbit like a veteran of war, clutched his mother's hand as they entered, his other hand resting gently on Bruno's back as the dog trotted beside him without leash or command. Just instinct, just heart. The sun was beginning to dip behind the trees, gold spilling across the hardwood floors, and Lucien, for the first time in weeks, laughed, not the high-pitched giggle of escape, but the low, rolling sound of safety blooming back into his chest. And he ran through the hallway, tugging Juliette toward the kitchen, pointing at the fridge, the window, the couch, declaring each object as if naming a kingdom that finally belonged to him. That night, Juliette tucked him into bed herself, folding the blanket over his small frame, brushing the curls away from his forehead, her hands never quite still, as if still afraid he might vanish when the lights went out. And Lucien, eyes already half closed, whispered, "Bruno?" And the dog, who had been waiting just outside the door, padded in, leapt softly onto the rug, and curled at the foot of the bed, tail wagging once before going. Lucien reached out a hand and rested it gently on Bruno's back, and within minutes the boy was asleep, deeply, peacefully, without the twitching shoulders or tight fists of trauma, his breathing even, his body slack in the pure vulnerability of a child who finally felt untouchable. Juliette stood in the doorway, watching him, one hand over her mouth, the other wrapped tight around her waist, and when Darius stepped beside her, quiet and grounded as always, she didn't speak for a long time, not until the clock tipped toward midnight and the room had gone completely still. And then she turned, barely above a whisper, and said, "You know, my son wasn't just saved, he was healed." And Darius didn't answer, not with words, but with the softest nod, his eyes on the boy, on the dog, on the breathing proof that sometimes the system broke, but people didn't. Not if they kept fighting, not if they listened when no one else did. And outside the window, the wind shifted through the trees, carrying the scent of roses not yet bloomed. If this story moved you even half as much as it moved us to tell it, consider liking the post and subscribing so you won't miss the next journey of hope, justice, and the bond between human and dog. Which part of Lucien's story hit you the hardest? Was it the courtroom scene, the reunion, or the moment Bruno barked when no one else dared to speak? And tell us, where in the world are you watching from? Drop your thoughts in the comments. We read every one.